The last call before the storm. Farlow wiped his hands across the polished bar top of the cosmic cantina, the familiar sound of the cloth dragging along the surface, soothing in its rhythm. The bar had been in his family for generations, and despite the galaxy's changes, it had always felt like home. Kental Station, where the cantina was situated, was no longer the bustling hub it had once been. The grug rush had long faded into history, and with it, the station's prosperity. But Kental still remained an important stop, a gateway to the lawless frontier worlds, where hope, greed, and desperation collided in a volatile mix. The space beyond was wild, and the station was the last bastion of civilization before that uncertainty. Farlow had never planned on inheriting the cantina. He was one of hundreds of siblings, each with their own ambitions and goals. For him, the stars were a call to adventure. He had imagined himself as a scavenger, charting unknown territories and trading in the relics of lost civilizations. But fate had a different plan. The culling, a devastating event that had claimed the lives of his entire brood, left him the sole heir. He had almost sold the cantina, tired of the memories it carried. But his wife, Gia, had convinced him otherwise. She had been right, as always. They would keep it, and with time, it became their sanctuary. The cantina was large for its type, a spacious, welcoming place designed to cater to the diverse array of species that passed through Kental. Farlow's grandfather had spared no expense when designing it. The walls were lined with hivestone, a material known for its durability, and the floors were crafted from lion, which absorbed odors and kept the air fresh. Lighting was dim, but full spectrum, allowing patrons to adjust the ambience as they wished. Modular tables and chairs made sure that every creature, no matter their shape or size, could sit comfortably. The place was designed for comfort, for peace, a rare thing in these days of lawlessness. But tonight was different. The usual crowd had gathered, but a palpable tension hung in the air. Outlaws, exiles, and hopeful colonists filled the seats, murmuring quietly to one another. Farlow's eyes drifted across the room, taking in the familiar faces, but something felt off. In the back, a new group had arrived. They weren't just any patrons, they were dangerous. Farlow could feel it in his bones. 4 figures, heavily armed, seated themselves at a table. Their cybernetics flickered ominously in the dim light, and their movements were deliberate, calculated. They had no ident badges, outlaws, most likely. But there was something more unsettling about them, something that made Farlow's instincts itch. These weren't just your run-of-the-mill criminals. They were professionals, and they were in trouble. I'm telling you, it's gotta be the feds. The voice of old Drago cut through Farlow's musings. Drago was a Flaxian, tall, hairy, and with a set of 3 eyes that could spot trouble from a mile away. He and Hiller had been regulars at the cantina for as long as Farlow could remember. The two had their share of adventures, but tonight, they were deep in discussion. I don't think so, Drago, Hylar, a Philan with an abundance of dyed orange fur, chimed in. The feds don't care about the frontier, not unless it's about a paycheck. Farlow couldn't help but listen. Drago and Hiller were experts when it came to rumors and the undercurrent of galactic affairs. They had their eyes on the table in the back as well. But the discussion wasn't just about the outlaws, something more was brewing. They're a new gang, Drago insisted. The Hulls. I've heard whispers, and that ain't something you just brush off. Hiller shook his head. No, it's bigger than that. Someone else is pulling the strings. This isn't just your average heist, Drago. Farlow leaned against the bar, trying to stay out of their conversation, but unable to ignore the pull of curiosity. His mind raced. These weren't just random criminals. Whatever was going on here, it had the potential to ripple across the station, and perhaps far beyond it. As Gia made her way through the cantina, her graceful movements caught the eye of many. Farlow's heart swelled with pride. His gaze never strayed too far from her. She was an uplifting presence in this chaotic world. her forearms extended in gentle, practiced movements as she delivered drinks and exchanged pleasantries with patrons. Gia wasn't just his wife. She was the light of Kental Station. The way her lavender exoskeleton shimmered in the soft light, the gentle flutter of her wings when she laughed, it was all enough to make anyone stop and stare. But tonight, even Gia seemed out of place. Farlow could feel it in his chest. The air was thick with unease, and the sense that something bad was about to unfold was undeniable. At one table near the back, a voice rang out, brash and loud, disrupting the quiet. It was the Ronder, a hulking creature with a mouth for a head and a single eye in his abdomen. Farlow had seen his kind before. The Ronder, like most species, were known for their short tempers and intimidating size. This one, named Claude, had a reputation for causing trouble wherever he went. "Oi, girl, come over here," the Ronder barked at Gia. Farlow's instincts kicked in, but before he could move, Gia was already there, her usual calm demeanor unshaken. She had dealt with far worse in her years, and the drunk Ronder was no exception. Farlow watched, his heart racing as she handled the situation with ease. But the knot in his stomach tightened when he saw the rest of the gang. The Grotto, in particular, stood out. Massive, clad in titanium-enhanced armor, his glowing blue plates shimmering with deadly intent. Farlow's cybernetics scanned him, confirming what Farlow had feared. The Grotto wasn't just any outlaw. This one was nobility, a warrior with the backing of a whole clan. If things went south, they would have no chance. Farlow had dealt with outlaws before. He had dealt with gangs, thugs, and all manner of dangerous creatures. But this felt different. The air was thick with tension, and his gut told him that he wouldn't be able to just talk his way out of this one. The Grotto, Brill, as Farlow had learned from his cybernetic scan, slammed his fist onto the table, calling for everyone's attention. "Listen up, Bug," he sneered, addressing Gia. "We ain't paying for these drinks." Gia, ever composed, didn't flinch. "If you don't pay, I'll have to call security," she said calmly. Brill's eyes glinted with malice, and Farlow's heart dropped. The Brill gang had a reputation, a ruthless one. They were known for stomping across the frontier, taking what they wanted, and leaving chaos in their wake. They weren't the type to back down easily, and they certainly weren't the type to pay for their drinks. Farlow could feel the tension in his bones. He could sense that Gia was about to be caught up in something bigger than either of them could handle. And as Brill leaned in, a wicked smile spreading across his face, Farlow knew it was time to act. But it wouldn't be easy. Not with the Grotto noble armed to the teeth. Farlow's hands twitched toward his hidden weapons, his mind running through the possible outcomes. He knew what he had to do, but he also knew the stakes. This wasn't just a simple bar fight. This was the beginning of something far more dangerous, and he had no idea how deep it went. As the confrontation unfolded before him, Farlow's resolve hardened. Whatever it took, he would protect Gia, protect the cantina, and keep his family safe, even if it meant facing the darkness of the frontier head-on. The last call before the storm had sounded, and Farlow knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Shadows of the past. Farlow stood frozen behind the bar, his eyes never leaving the scene unfolding before him. The air in the cosmic cantina was thick with the unmistakable tension of a storm ready to break. The Grotto noble, Brill, leaned forward with a vicious smirk, his thick armored fingers brushing against the edge of the table. His crew, the Ronder, the Scarl, and the small, mech-encased Gizmoti, were all staring at Gia, each with their own brand of menace written across their faces. But it wasn't just the gang's aggression that worried Farlow. It was something deeper, a weight, a gnawing feeling in his gut that told him this moment would mark the beginning of something far worse than he could imagine. Gia, ever poised, kept her calm. Her lavender exoskeleton gleamed faintly in the ambient light as her forearms, graceful and strong, adjusted her stance. Her multifaceted red eyes narrowed, her wings fluttering slightly as she smiled. There was no fear in her expression. She had dealt with far worse creatures than these, and she was not one to bow to intimidation. "I'll say it one more time," she said, her voice a soft but unyielding command. "You either pay for the drinks, or I'll have to call security." Brill let out a low, rumbling laugh. "Security? You think they'll help you, Bug? We run this station now. You're on our time, and you'll do as we say." His voice was grating, like rocks grinding together, but there was a sharpness to his words that made everyone else in the room tense. Farlow knew that if security responded, they'd be no help. Kental Station's law enforcement had always been a patchwork of half-hearted efforts, too underfunded to make a real impact on the growing lawlessness of the frontier. He had seen the same thing time and time again. Security forces too slow to act or too corrupt to care. In this corner of the galaxy, justice was an illusion, and survival was all that mattered. The Grotto noble's eyes flickered as he took in Jiz's response. He leaned back, his heavy armored body creaking as he adjusted himself in his chair. The plating of his suit glinted faintly under the dim lighting, a subtle but constant reminder of his station. Grotto nobles were not like regular criminals. They were respected or feared. Leaders of powerful families with deep pockets and vast influence. Their wrath could be deadly, and their revenge, often worse than death itself. Farlow's mind raced. If Brill was truly from one of the noble houses, killing him or even injuring him could spark a chain of events that would bring more destruction to Kental Station than the frontier had ever seen. The Grotto clan was known for its retribution, and Farlow wasn't naive enough to think he and Gia could escape the consequences of such an act. Brill's grin widened as he glanced around the cantina, surveying the few patrons who remained. The place was nearly empty now, with most of the regulars having wisely fled to safer corners of the station. Only Drago and Hilar, two of the oldest and most resilient creatures Farlow had ever known, remained by the bar, seemingly oblivious to the danger. Farlow knew better than to count on their help. They were too slow, too intoxicated to be of any use in a fight. If things went south, it would be up to him and Gia. "Enough of this," Brill snapped, his patience finally wearing thin. "I've had enough of this pay for your drinks nonsense. I'm taking over this place, and you'll do as I say." He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back with a violent crash. In a flash, Farlow's hand moved beneath the bar, his cybernetic interface immediately connecting with his weapons hidden in compartments beneath the surface. He gripped his breaking sticks, the pure tungsten rods weighing heavily in his hands. He had trained with them for years. He knew how to wield them with deadly precision, but even he knew that Brill, with his armor and his cybernetic enhancements, was far more dangerous than any regular thug. Gia's wings fluttered, a barely noticeable gesture that sent a brief wave of pheromones into the air. It was a signal, a silent understanding between her and Farlow. They were ready. They always had been, even when they had hoped they wouldn't need to be. Farlow had always known that the cantina's peaceful days would eventually end. It had been too quiet, too comfortable. The frontier was a beast that didn't let anyone stay unscathed for long. Brill's crew seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. The Rondar, Claude, let out a low growl, his single eye narrowing as he scanned the room. "You think you can take us on, Bug?" He spat, his voice thick with disdain. The Scarl, a tall, yellow-scaled creature with 6 legs and sharp pincers, tilted her head slightly, her beady eyes watching Gia with a strange interest. "Not enough blood spilled yet, but I'm sure we can make this entertaining," she mocked, her long tail swishing behind her in a subtle, almost predatory motion. Farlow's heart thudded in his chest. The gang was getting closer to the point of no return. The moment they crossed that line, it would be impossible to come back from it. The stakes were higher now. This wasn't just about the cantina. This was about survival. His survival, Gia's survival, and the survival of anyone who happened to be caught in the crossfire. Then, without warning, the door to the cantina swung open with a jarring squeal. Farlow's gaze snapped to the entrance, expecting more members of the Brill gang to arrive. But instead, a lone figure stood there, silhouetted by the harsh light outside. A human. He was tall, dressed in a long black coat that billowed slightly with the movement of the air. His face was hard to read, obscured by the shadows of the dim-lit room. He looked calm, collected, almost out of place in a cantina filled with outlaws. "Whiskey," the human said in a voice that held no trace of fear. Farlow's instincts flared. This wasn't the kind of person who wandered into places like this without a reason. He'd seen enough to know that strangers on the frontier didn't arrive without a purpose, especially not in a cantina owned by someone like him. And this human had walked in here with a quiet confidence, almost as if he already knew what was going to happen. Gia turned to address him, her expression softening at the sight of a new customer. "Whiskey, of course," she said, turning to prepare the drink. But Farlow didn't move. His cybernetics had already begun to scan the man. He had no visible weapons, no power sources, nothing to give away his intentions. And yet there was something about him that set Farlow on edge. The human had no ident badge, no official markings. He was a mystery, but mysteries, especially on Kental Station, were never good news. The human sat at the bar, calmly accepting the drink that Gia slid toward him. His movements were deliberate, and he seemed entirely unbothered by the growing tension in the cantina. Farlow couldn't help but watch him. Analyzing every movement, every gesture, there was something about the man that was off. He moved with the precision of someone who had been through 100 dangerous situations, someone who knew how to handle himself. But Farlow didn't know whether that meant the man was here to help or to add to the chaos. "Who are you?" Farlow finally asked, his voice low, his tone hard. The man didn't look up from his drink. "Just a traveler," he said softly, his voice calm, measured. "I'm not here to make trouble, just here for a drink." But Farlow didn't buy it, not for a second. Behind him, Brill's voice boomed again, this time with more menace. "What's this?" "A human. What do you want, little man? Looking for a fight?" The human didn't even flinch. He finished his whiskey, placed the glass down gently, and then turned his attention to Brill. "I'm not looking for a fight," he said quietly, his gaze locking with Brill's. "But if you want one, I'll be happy to oblige." For the first time, Brill faltered. The air in the cantina seemed to freeze as a silence settled over the room. Everyone, Farlow, Gia, the gang, watched in stunned disbelief as the human slowly stood up from his seat. The tension was unbearable, the kind of silence that precedes the inevitable clash of fates. And then, as the first crack of violence began to sound, Farlow realized something. This stranger, this human, was no ordinary traveler. He was about to change everything. The stranger's gambit. The cantina was silent, the heavy tension hanging thick in the air as the stranger stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the bar. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, as if the universe itself were holding its breath. Farlow's grip tightened on the breaking sticks beneath the bar, his mind racing. The human had no visible weapons, no gear to indicate he was anything more than a traveler passing through, and yet there was something about him. Something unsettling in the way he carried himself. Farlow's instincts screamed that the man was far from ordinary. Brill, the Grotto noble, stared at the human with a mix of amusement and skepticism. He leaned forward, his massive armored form creaking as he moved. "What's this? You think you're going to stand up to me, human?" His voice was low and threatening, each word dripping with disdain. "You're in the wrong place if you're looking for trouble. This is my station, and you'll learn that real quick, little man." The human didn't flinch. He didn't even seem to blink. He met Brill's gaze with a cold, almost indifferent stare, as though the threat the Grotto presented was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The bar's patrons had stopped talking, all eyes fixed on the exchange. It wasn't every day that a single human walked into the cantina and made a noble like Brill hesitate. "Not looking for trouble. "No," the human replied, his voice calm, level, but filled with a quiet confidence that seemed to echo in the silence. "But I'm not backing down either." Farlow's heart skipped a beat. There was something in the stranger's words, something that hit too close to home. It wasn't just a defiant response. It was a statement of intent. The human wasn't just here to drink. He was here to make a stand. And Farlow could see the ripples of danger starting to unfurl from that single decision. Gia's antennae twitched, and for a brief second, her eyes locked with Farlow's. He could see the same realization in her gaze. She, too, recognized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a bar fight waiting to happen. This was the kind of confrontation that could change everything. But who was this human? And what did he hope to accomplish by challenging Brill? The human's eyes flicked briefly toward Gia, a brief moment of connection that told Farlow that the stranger was aware of her presence, of the situation unfolding. There was no panic in his expression, only a calm determination. Farlow felt a strange chill run down his spine. This was a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Brill chuckled, the sound vibrating with menace. "You think you can walk in here and make demands?" he growled. "You're in the wrong place at the wrong time, little man. My crew and I don't take kindly to anyone trying to show us up." He gestured to his gang, who were already positioning themselves, hands hovering over their weapons. Farlow's gaze darted to the table where the Rondar, the Scarl, and the Gizmoti sat, watching the human carefully. It wasn't just Brill who was dangerous. It was all of them. Outlaws, exiles, creatures with their own motivations, all bound together by a single desire, to take whatever they could from others without mercy. But the human, standing in the middle of the cantina, seemed completely unfazed. He took a step forward, his boots clicking softly against the floor as he closed the distance between himself and Brill's table. The entire room seemed to exhale in unison as the tension built to a crescendo. "You don't scare me, Grotto," the human said, his words sharp as blades. "I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to end this. Your reign of terror on this station ends tonight." The words hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown down in the face of the most dangerous gang in the frontier. Farlow's mind raced. What was this man thinking? Brill wasn't just any outlaw. He was a Grotto noble, the heir to a powerful family. Killing him could set off a chain of events that would bring untold chaos to Kental Station. The Grotto clan would come for them, and the entire station would burn. And yet, the human didn't hesitate. He wasn't bluffing. There was no fear in his voice, no hesitation in his eyes. If anything, his calmness seemed to make Brill even more furious. Brill's hand shot out, slamming onto the table as he roared with laughter. "You're either the bravest man I've ever seen or the stupidest," he said, his voice booming with arrogance. "Either way, you're going to regret this." He stood up, his massive frame towering over the human. And for a moment, it seemed like the confrontation would escalate into violence. Farlow's grip tightened on his weapons beneath the bar, ready to intervene if things went south. Gia was already shifting her position, her forearms poised to strike if needed. But then, in the blink of an eye, everything changed. The human's hand moved faster than Farlow's eyes could follow, drawing a sleek, unfamiliar weapon from beneath his coat. It wasn't a blaster. Farlow could tell that much. No, this was something different. The weapon looked primitive, almost like an old-fashioned projectile weapon, but its design was sleek and precise. Before anyone could react, the human fired. A sharp, metallic crack filled the air, and Brill's expression faltered for the briefest moment as he looked down at his chest. A hole had been punched through his armor, the fabric and plating shredded apart, as if it had been nothing more than paper. The Grotto noble's hand trembled as he reached for his chest, blood seeping through the gaps in his armor. The silence that followed was deafening. The cantina, once filled with the chatter of patrons and the quiet hum of conversation, now held its breath. The human's weapon was unlike anything Farlow had ever seen. It was powerful, precise, and it had just disabled one of the most dangerous beings in the frontier with a single shot. Brill staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock. He hadn't expected this. None of them had. Impossible, Brill muttered, his voice barely a whisper as his hand struggled to cover the wound. You're using kinetics. The human didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood there, cool and collected, watching as Brill's gang began to assess the situation, unsure of what to do next. The Rondar, Claude, was the first to react. He moved toward the human, but the Scarl held him back with a quick gesture. The gang knew that Brill's injury was no small matter. This human had just brought the Grotto noble to his knees, with a weapon that no one had seen in the frontier before. The Gizmodi, still perched in his mechanical exosuit, shifted uneasily, as if debating whether to engage or retreat. The tension in the cantina was thick, but the human didn't seem to care. He turned his attention to Farlow, offering a quick, almost imperceptible nod. Farlow couldn't place it. Was it gratitude? A warning? All he knew was that in that brief moment, the human's eyes seemed to say everything. The man wasn't here to make friends. He wasn't here for any reason other than to clean house. I'll make you a deal. The human spoke again, his voice steady. You can leave now, or we can finish this. But if you want to live, I suggest you take your men and get out while you still can. The gang hesitated. The Grotto, though injured, was not dead. But the resolve in the human's voice was clear. He would not back down. Brill may have been a noble, but this human was a force of nature. Farlow could feel it. The shift in power. The end of the line for the Brill gang. The frontier was about to change, and whether Farlow liked it or not, he was witnessing the start of something new. Something powerful. Brill gritted his teeth, his rage building, but then, with a heavy breath, he straightened up, his pride barely holding him together. You think you can stand against the entire Grotto clan? He spat, his voice hoarse. You've made a grave mistake, human. But the human wasn't intimidated. He simply holstered his weapon, his eyes locked on Brill's. We'll see about that, won't we? With that, the battle lines were drawn. And Farlow knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be the same again. The cantina, once a place of refuge, had now become ground zero for a new kind of war. A war fought with resilience, determination, and a deadly human ingenuity that no one had anticipated. The storm was only beginning, and the full force of what was to come hadn't even begun to reveal itself. The weight of the storm. The silence in the cantina was suffocating, and for a few heartbeats, it seemed like the entire universe had frozen. The air was thick with tension as the Grotto noble, Brill, stood there, clutching his chest, where the shot had torn through his armor. His massive form swayed unsteadily, blood slowly seeping through the cracks in his plating, and for the first time in what must have been centuries, the Grotto's arrogance faltered. Farlow watched it all unfold in an eerie calm, his eyes darting between Brill, his gang, and the mysterious human who had instigated this chaos. The atmosphere in the cantina had shifted irreversibly. No longer was it a place of simple transactions and fleeting encounters. Now it had become a battleground for something larger, a clash of ideals, of power, and perhaps even fate itself. The weight of that realization settled heavily on Farlow's shoulders, and a cold sweat began to form at the back of his neck. Gia, ever graceful, stood near the bar, her wings trembling slightly as she gauged the situation. Farlow could feel the tension in her stance, the unspoken understanding between them. They had faced danger together before, but this was different. This human, this stranger, had just taken on a Grotto noble and the entire Brill gang without hesitation. His quiet confidence was as much a weapon as anything else in the cantina, and yet there was something about him that gnawed at Farlow's insides. The man wasn't just a warrior. He wasn't here for a quick fight or even for justice. He was here for something else entirely. The silence dragged on, and then finally, Brill broke it, his voice a low growl, thick with rage and disbelief. "You think this changes anything?" He spat. "You shoot me, you take my crew down, and you think you've won. This is my station, human. My turf. My rules." The human didn't respond immediately. He stood there, hands at his sides, a slight smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He wasn't a fool. He knew what Brill was trying to do. He was trying to provoke him, to get him to react. But the human wasn't buying into it. Farlow had seen men like Brill before, all loud and brash with power, until someone came along who didn't fear them. That fearlessness, that refusal to back down, was what truly separated the strong from the weak in the galaxy. And this man, this human, was proving that the frontier, for all its brutality, was a place where anything could happen. The Grotto Nobles gang was shifting nervously. Claude, the Rondeur, looked ready to charge, but the Scarl and the Gizmoti both hesitated, their eyes darting from one side to the other. They had seen the human's speed. They had felt his precision. The question was no longer whether or not they could win. It was whether they were willing to push forward and risk the same fate as Brill. The odds were turning against them. "Do you really want to test me?" the human asked, his voice deceptively calm, each word cutting through the tension like a knife. "I fought worse than you, Brill, and I've killed harder men than any of your crew. You may control this station, but you're not the only one with power." Brill's eyes narrowed as he staggered back, his breath ragged. The wound in his chest was significant, but it wasn't the kind of injury that would kill him outright. Not yet. But Farlow could see it. Brill's pride was the real casualty here. He had never expected to meet someone who could take him down so easily. Grotto nobles were accustomed to being feared, revered even. But this human had just shown them all what it meant to be truly fearless. The human didn't make a move toward Brill. Instead, he stepped back, his gaze never leaving the grotto. "You and your gang have terrorized this station for too long, and now it's time to put an end to it." It was then that the door to the cantina opened again. Farlow's gaze flickered toward the entrance, and for a brief moment, he thought he might be seeing reinforcements for the Brill gang. But no, it wasn't more of them. It was something else entirely. A group of figures emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim light of the cantina. They were dressed in simple but effective gear, their movements deliberate and silent. Farlow's cybernetics scanned them immediately. No ident badges, no formal markings, just an air of danger that was palpable. These were no ordinary travelers. These were people who had seen the depths of the galaxy's darkest corners. And judging by their expressions, they weren't here to drink or listen to tales of bravado. They were here for something far more serious. The leader of the group, a tall human, even taller than the one who had already caused such a stir, stepped forward. His eyes scanned the cantina quickly, assessing the situation, before settling on the human who had already made his mark. Farlow noticed a subtle recognition in the way they looked at each other. There was a shared history between these two, something deeper than the mere exchange of words. "I see you've made quite the entrance," the new arrival said, his voice cool and commanding. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." Farlow's heart skipped. There was no fear in the leader's voice, no hesitation. It was the kind of confidence Farlow had come to expect from those who had been in the game too long. It wasn't the kind of confidence that came from arrogance. It came from knowledge. The knowledge that the only way to survive in the frontier was to be tougher, faster, and smarter than everyone else. The human who had already challenged Brill didn't flinch at the new arrival. He didn't seem particularly surprised. In fact, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, almost as if he had been expecting them. "You're late," he said, the corner of his mouth curling into a wry smile. "But I appreciate the backup." Farlow was stunned. Backup? From another human? What kind of strange, deadly game was this man playing? Farlow had thought the human was a lone wolf, a traveler passing through. But it was becoming clear that there was far more at play than he had originally assumed. The universe, as it turned out, had a way of throwing unexpected alliances into the mix, especially when the stakes were this high. Brill, now barely standing and still grasping at his wound, snarled at the newcomers. "You think you can just walk in here and take control? This is my station. I own it. No one takes what's mine." The human who had already brought Brill to his knees stepped forward again, this time with a purpose. "This station, no, this place has belonged to people like you for far too long. But tonight, that ends." For the first time, Brill's expression faltered, his arrogance replaced by a flicker of doubt. He was used to being in control, used to being feared, but this human was different. This human had come to take that control from him, and by the looks of things, he was more than capable of following through. "You're done, Brill," the human said, his voice hard, final. "The game's over." Brill's mouth twisted into a grimace of fury, and just as he was about to shout another retort, the door to the cantina slammed open once more. This time, there was no hesitation. A tall, armored figure strode in, his presence radiating authority. Farlow could feel the shift in the air, the arrival of someone who had been sent to bring an end to the chaos that had begun. It was time to decide whose side this cantina would fall on. And Farlow, watching from the bar, could already tell this was no longer just about outlaws or authority. This was about something far greater. Something was coming. Something that would change the frontier forever. And the storm that had begun with one man's shot was far from over.